Okay, only 10 more presents to wrap. You're almost at the finish line. But first... There, the last one. Enjoy a Coca-Cola for a pause that refreshes.
The Roger Stone Show on the Red Apple Podcast Network.
Welcome. Thanks for joining the Roger Stone Show today. Yesterday was the 62nd anniversary of the assassination of President John Fitzgerald Kennedy on the streets of Dallas. So I have a pot of Sunday gravy, also known as bolognese sauce, on the stove. 1/3 beef, 1/3 pork, 1/3 veal. It's been cooking for about 2 hours, and by the end of the show, it'll be 4 hours. I'm going to serve it over some nice rigatoni as soon as the show is over. So sit back, relax, and listen to me decimate the findings of the Warren Commission, which continues to insist that Lee Harvey Oswald, a lone nut, killed President John F. Kennedy without ever providing a motive for him to do so. Last night, I decided to kind of relax with my wife, and I watched Oliver Stone's epic movie, JFK. If you haven't seen it, or you haven't seen it in a while, I strongly recommend it to you. Kevin Costner plays New Orleans District Attorney Jim Garrison, and his summation at the trial of New Orleans businessman Clay Shaw, who many years later it was proven was indeed a CIA asset, is perhaps the greatest single summary of why the idea that Lee Harvey Oswald killed John F. Kennedy and acted alone is nonsensical. You can also go back on one of the previous anniversaries of the assassination of JFK. I debated Gerald Posner, who is a friend of mine, a very, very smart guy, a very able lawyer. He's written an excellent book on 9/11, but his epic book, Case Closed, well, it's a laughable joke. My book, The Man Who Killed Kennedy, The Case Against LBJ, a New York Times bestseller, I think is still the single best summary of what I believe was a plot helmed by Vice President Lyndon Baines Johnson. Now, in a recent article, an author named M.C. Armstrong, who has a lot of scholarship in his writing, tries to make the case that I say that LBJ alone murdered John F. Kennedy. Well, of course, that's not what I say at all. It is my theory, and I'm not an attorney, but if you read my book, I think you'll see that I'm the one who closed the case, is that Lyndon Baines Johnson, working in concert with the Central Intelligence Agency, organized crime, the mob, and Big Texas Oil, as well as certain international influences, was responsible for an orchestrated plot to kill our 35th president. Let's go immediately to the question of motive. Lyndon Baines Johnson was facing two epic corruption scandals that were all over the news. First, there was the Bobby Baker scandal. Bobby Baker was the Secretary of the U.S. Senate. He was Lyndon Johnson's right-hand man. He was under investigation for soliciting and accepting bribes on behalf of LBJ. Indeed, Drew Pearson, who was the most influential syndicated columnist of his day, had a column already sent out to his syndication newspapers accusing Vice President Lyndon Johnson of taking a massive bribe for a defense contract that was given to General Dynamics. Johnson was also under investigation in the Billy Saul Estes scandal. Billy Saul Estes was a flamboyant Texas wheeler dealer. Johnson had gotten Estes multi-million-dollar agricultural department contracts for fertilizer tanks in Texas that, well, actually didn't exist. Saul Estes was kicking back to Johnson. In fact, the hearings into Bobby Baker actually opened on November 21st, the day before the assassination. So Johnson's motive was acute. Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy had already begun telling people that LBJ would be dropped from the 1964 ticket and would be replaced most likely by North Carolina Governor Terry Sanford. So it was Lyndon Baines Johnson who convinced JFK to visit Dallas. The putative purpose for the visit was to bind up the divisions between the more liberal wing of the Texas Democrat Party, headed by Senator Ralph Yarborough, the U.S. Senator who was an arch enemy of Lyndon Johnson, and the conservative Bourbon wing of the Democrat Party of Texas, headed by Texas Governor John Connally, who had previously served as Lyndon Johnson's administrative assistant when he was the Senate Majority Leader, and was, of course, famously in the car and wounded when President Kennedy was killed. Now, the motorcade route was dictated by Connally. In his own biography, Jerry Bruno, the chief advance man for John Kennedy, writes that it was Connally who insisted that the presidential motorcade go through Dealey Plaza. This makes very little sense because Kennedy was traveling from the Fort Worth Dallas Airport, or the Dallas-Fort Worth Airport, pardon me, to the International Merchandise Mart, both of which are outside the city limits. So why the motorcade dipped into the city, but more importantly, why it went on a route which required the presidential limousine to come to a full stop before taking a hard left turn, in total violation of the Secret Service manual, is because Connally, Johnson, insisted on this motorcade route. Then we know from the writings of Jacqueline Kennedy that on the night before the assassination, Vice President Lyndon Johnson went to President Kennedy's hotel room and argued that in the motorcade that Senator Yarborough should ride with the president and that Governor Connally should ride in the vice presidential limousine, a Cadillac known as the Queen Mary, which was out of the normal sequence of a presidential motorcade when the vice president was included, strangely enough, but that Kennedy refused, saying it defeated the whole purpose of the trip, which was to have people see Connally, the leader of the conservative wing of the Democrat Party, embracing the thought to be liberal president JFK. Then, of course, there is the strange question of Madeline Brown. Madeline Brown was Lyndon Johnson's mistress. She spent the night with him in the Fort Worth Hotel the night before the assassination. She was first interviewed, and this became public when she was interviewed by Geraldo Rivera. She would later be interviewed by Alex Jones. She said in both those interviews that Lyndon Johnson told her both the night before and the morning of the assassination that after today, I will never have to put up with those Irish SOBs again. Madeline Brown bore Lyndon Johnson a son, Stephen Brown. You can see his picture online. He looks just like his daddy. He, of course, would die under mysterious circumstances. And then there is, of course, the most important tie to Lyndon Johnson, and that is that although I believe that there were multiple shooters, and this is borne out recently by a documentary on Paramount called What the Parkland Doctors Saw, where multiple doctors who attended President Kennedy when he was rushed to Parkland Hospital, at the same time, by the way, they were hosing out the back of his limousine, tampering with the crime scene, something we saw on the roof in Butler, Pennsylvania more recently, when they hosed down the roof from which Thomas Matthew Crooks allegedly shot. But Malcolm Wallace was tied to Johnson largely because his fingerprint number 29 in the Warren Commission, unidentified at the time of the Warren Commission, is that of Malcolm Wallace. Who is Malcolm Wallace? Malcolm Wallace is a hatchet man for Lyndon Johnson. We know that Malcolm Wallace's fingerprint, as identified, is his, because in 1951, Malcolm Wallace was arrested and convicted for first-degree murder when he murdered a man named John Douglas Kinzer. Kinzer was blackmailing Senator Lyndon Johnson. Kinzer was involved in a love triangle with Johnson's, shall we say, bohemian sister. In March 9th of 1998, certified latent fingerprint examiner A. Nathan Darby filed an affidavit testifying to the fact that print 29, found in the crow's nest on the cardboard box in front of the window from which it is alleged Lee Harvey Oswald shot, actually was the print of Malcolm Mac Wallace. Darby located a 14-point matching identification in his first analysis and 34 points of a match in a later analysis. In a standard court of law, 8 to 12 points is the standard legal standard for credible match. So we also know that at least 6 witnesses saw a man who met the physical description of Mac Wallace standing in the 6th floor window of the Texas School Book Depository building just prior to the shooting. Every one of these witnesses identifies a man who they say is balding, wearing spectacles, has a tan jacket and light-colored trousers. None of this, of course, is reported in the Warren Commission, where there is no reference to Malcolm Mac Wallace. So we have fingerprint evidence that ties a man who's very clearly tied to Lyndon Johnson, found on the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository building. When I come back, I will further tell you about Lyndon Johnson's ties to the Kennedy assassination, but let's not get away from motive, means, and opportunity. Motive, means, and opportunity. LBJ at first wanted a Texas State Commission to investigate the Kennedy assassination, but then he told Earl Warren, who only reluctantly headed the Warren Commission, that the Russians had killed JFK and that the chief needed to help to keep that from the American people. You're listening to The Roger Stone Show. We'll be back to eviscerate the rest of the Warren Commission in just a minute.
The Roger Stone Show on the Red Apple Podcast Network. Roger Stone Show. Entertaining and informative on the Red Apple Podcast Network.
And we're back. Yesterday was the 62nd anniversary of the murder of President John F. Kennedy, and I'm outlining for you what really happened. You see, President Donald Trump issued an executive order ordering the National Archives to release all of the documents that have been long hidden by the federal government. The problem, in the nutshell, is that order is not broad enough because there are certain organizations within the government, the Central Intelligence Agency, the FBI, the IRS, Naval Intelligence, Army Intelligence, that retain documents that they never gave to the National Archives. It is only due to the persistence and grit of Congresswoman Anna Paulina Luna and the Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, that they have used the subpoena power of the U.S. House to go after those documents for a fuller picture. Nothing I have seen so far disproves the idea that Lyndon Baines Johnson, the man with the most to gain, and also facing prison for corruption, the most to lose, helmed a plot that included the Central Intelligence Agency, organized crime, and big Texas oil to remove JFK. The CIA's motive is absolutely clear. They blamed Kennedy for the bungling of the Bay of Pigs invasion, the invasion by U.S. organized Cuban refugees to invade Cuba. But the plan that they sold to JFK included 29 Panamanian-flagged bombers that were supposed to be flown by Cuban pilots. The number 3 man in the CIA, Charles Cable, happened to be the brother of Dallas Mayor Earl Cable, who controlled the Dallas police during the investigation, canceled that air cover for the men storming the beaches. Then, of course, there was the Cuban Missile Crisis. I know you've been told that brave Jack and Bobby Kennedy faced down Nikita Khrushchev, who removed the missiles from Cuba. But that's a lie. Declassified documents released 40 years later prove to us that the Kennedy brothers made a secret deal with Khrushchev to remove our NATO missiles from Turkey and Italy, changing the balance of power in Europe. And the agreement with Khrushchev included no on-site inspections. Men as distinguished as former ambassador to Cuba, our last ambassador, Earl E.T. Smith, believes the missiles actually never left. JFK threatened to smash the CIA into 1,000,000 pieces. There is their motive for removing John F. Kennedy. Then there was the mob. Ambassador Joseph P. Kennedy, John Kennedy's father, who was partners with Frank Costello in the bootlegging business, all the way from New York all the way to the Canadian border, convened a meeting in Chicago in which all the mob chieftains agreed, with the exception of two, Cameron Humphreys, who ran the mob in Las Vegas, and Mickey Cohen, who ran the mob in L.A. They said they had already invested heavily in Vice President Richard Nixon. They stormed out of the room. But the mobsters agreed to give JFK's campaign $1 million, a princely sum in 1963, and to twist arms for him in return for a pledge from Ambassador Kennedy that the deportation proceedings against Santo Trafficante, who ran the mob in Florida, and Carlos Marcello, who ran the mob in both Texas and Louisiana, would be ended under a Kennedy administration. Unfortunately, Ambassador Kennedy was stricken by a debilitating stroke. Robert F. Kennedy went after both mobsters, and it explains their motive for the involvement. And lastly, of course, Big Texas Oil. LBJ was the water carrier for Big Texas Oil, but John and Robert Kennedy wanted to repeal the oil depletion allowance, which meant that the Texas oil men would be forced to spend hundreds of millions in new taxes. When we come back, I'm going to continue to tell you some shocking things you don't know about the Kennedy assassination. So whatever you do, don't touch that dial. We'll be right back with more on the day after the 62nd anniversary of the brutal murder of President John F. Kennedy.
The Roger Stone Show on the Red Apple Podcast Network. The Roger Stone Show. Entertaining and informative on the Red Apple Podcast Network.
Welcome back. Yesterday was the 67th anniversary of the murder of JFK, and we are decimating the conventional wisdom narrative that Lee Harvey Oswald, a lone nut, shot John F. Kennedy 3 times from the back. A feat, by the way, that no U.S. military marksman has been able to duplicate in the time required. I contend that there was a conspiracy that involved the CIA, the mob, and Big Texas Oil, but it was Lyndon Johnson at the helm. Why do I say this? Well, first of all, E. Howard Hunt, the famous CIA operative and Watergate burglar, who was admitted on his deathbed that he was on the scene in Dealey Plaza on November 22nd, 1963, said that Johnson was running the show. We also know that Johnson, as the Senate Majority Leader, took the very odd and unusual position of appointing himself to the Subcommittee of Defense Appropriations, where the CIA's black box budgets were prepared. In other words, he was the paymaster for the CIA. As far as the mob, Johnson was being bribed by the mob in Texas, by Carlos Marcello. The bagman was a man named Jack Halfer. Marcello was paying LBJ to protect his illegal gambling dens in Houston, Dallas, and San Antonio. Amazing. Jack Halfer, who had been convicted on some other minor crime, received a full and unconditional presidential pardon from President Lyndon Johnson on November 23rd. 1963. The same day that column by Drew Pearson that accused Johnson of corruption in the General Dynamics defense contract was spiked. And then there's a whole series of anomalies. Why was the Warren Commission never allowed to see either the x-rays or the actual photos of JFK's autopsy? Instead, they were given artists' renderings of them. Why, when he was tested by the Dallas police, were there no powder or nitrate burns on the hands or the chest or the arms of Lee Harvey Oswald? Indeed, why didn't they even test the weapon they claimed was used to kill Kennedy to see if it had been shot that day? They didn't. Then there's the strange question of the telex that went to all FBI bureaus on the 17th, warning of a plot to kill Kennedy in Dallas, a telex which disappears from the records after the 22nd. But on the 22nd, there is a telex that goes to all FBI bureaus in the country, identifying Lee Harvey Oswald as the arrested man. The problem is that the telex goes out 10 minutes before Oswald has been apprehended in the Dallas movie theater. Evelyn Lincoln, who was President Kennedy's personal assistant, was in shock, but nonetheless, on the plane ride from Dallas, she wrote a short list of those she believed were responsible. Her list, which was written on November 26, 1963, flying back from the scene, at the top of her list was Lyndon. She further went on to say, additionally, J. Edgar Hoover, the Mafia, the CIA, and the Cubans in Florida. And now more recently, we have a tape more recently released in 1971 from the great-grandson of Billy Sol Estes, the Johnson crony and former, and this is a tape of the former executive director of the Democrat National Committee during Johnson's presidency, in which he specifically says to Sol Estes that Lyndon Baines Johnson hired Mac Wallace to assassinate the president. We've played that tape right here on the Roger Stone Show. No, I think that the anomalies here are overwhelming. A little later in the show, Lawrence Schnapp, one of the most respected JFK assassination researchers in the country, is going to tell us about a KGB report that J. Edgar Hoover told President Johnson about. The Russian intelligence operation did their own investigation, only to learn that the Russians concluded that Lyndon Johnson was the perp. No, I think the only person still living who believes that Lee Harvey Oswald killed John F. Kennedy and acted alone is my friend Gerald Posner. I debated him. You can go to my X channel and see that debate. It was an epic debate. He's a very able and smart lawyer, very clever guy. On the other hand, last week I saw him write a piece in which he attacked those who question whether Thomas Matthew Crooks is indeed the man who shot and almost killed President Donald Trump. So, well, Gerald Posner is at it again. In the meantime, I'm looking forward to the hearings being run by Anna Paulina Luna, because coming up is an examination of the assassination of Senator Robert F. Kennedy, who was murdered on the night of his greatest triumph. You have the same problems there that you have with the John F. Kennedy assassination. Sirhan, the man convicted of the murder of Robert F. Kennedy, was always in front of Kennedy. He got off 8 shots. All 8 of those shots have been accounted for. None of them hit the senator. Thomas Noguchi, the Los Angeles County medical examiner, one of the most respected pathologists in the country, says in his autopsy that RFK was shot at point-blank range from behind. Point-blank range means with the barrel of the gun right up against the lower left of his skull. There's a great interview with Bobby Kennedy, my friend Robert F. Kennedy Jr., currently serving as the Secretary of Health and Human Services, with Mike Tyson, in which all of this is explored, but you may have trouble finding it because YouTube took it down within 10 minutes of it being posted. You can find it if you look for it. I am really hoping that Bobby Kennedy, the current secretary, decides to testify for an open house hearing into the brutal assassination of his own father. So much more will be revealed. And then, frankly, I'm going to do a segment on this. The murder of Dr. Martin Luther King is not what the government tells it was. The King family would ultimately sue the Secret Service, the Memphis Police, the FBI in a civil suit and win, which means that James Earl Ray, who later recanted his claim that he killed Dr. King, is also probably a government patsy. We'll leave that for another day. As I have predicted, the Epstein emails now fully released blew up in the Democrats' face. New revelations from Jeffrey Epstein's email correspondence show that he was in particularly close contact with Steve Bannon, obliterating Bannon's story that he was producing a documentary to expose the deceased child sex fiend. Indeed, according to the emails we can all read, Bannon was a friend, a close advisor, and perhaps even a co-conspirator of Epstein's in the final days before Epstein's murder. And this was long after it was known that Epstein was raping children. Now, I have my own beef with Steve Bannon. I think everyone knows that. When called, as I was, to testify before the House Intelligence Committee during the Russian collusion hoax, he was asked by Senator, then Congressman Adam Schiff, did you ever speak to Roger Stone about WikiLeaks, Julian Assange, or these allegedly stolen emails? And Bannon said, no, never. On no occasion, says Schiff. No, never, says Bannon. I think he was telling the truth at the time. In fact, I know he was because I never discussed this matter with Steve Bannon. But then you can imagine my surprise when Steve Bannon, kind of like a bloated Johnny Cash, showed up all in black with a lot of dandruff on his shoulders as a surprise witness for the government at my trial in Washington, D.C. And when he was asked the exact same thing, he said, no. I spoke to Stone about WikiLeaks in every phone conversation I had with him. I considered him the campaign's access point to WikiLeaks, which, of course, is an egregious lie. That's called perjury, and it is why I have my problems with Steve Bannon. As some of you may know, I actually challenged Bannon to a bare-knuckle fight. The bare-knuckle fight championship is coming up in at the Hard Rock in Hollywood, Florida, and I asked Bannon to step into the ring. I kind of doubt, given his physical condition, that he will do so. But it is without any question whatsoever that he has now been fully and completely exposed. It is amazing to me that he got away with it this far. Before we descend into the cavern of Steve Bannon's duplicity, let's begin where at least expected. I've challenged him to this boxing match. I hope that he will accept. But if I may, just go to the actual quote from the New York Post. Jonathan Turley, who is the famous George Washington University law professor, examined the transcripts of Bannon's testimony before the House Committee and his testimony in my trial. And he was very specific. Turley specifically says, there does appear to be a glaring and irreconcilable conflict in what Bannon stated in testimony before Congress and what he stated before the court. What is striking is that this was not a peripheral point, but one of the main areas of inquiry. He has two diametrically opposed sworn statements in a high-profile controversy with dozens of attorneys in attendance. The scandal currently unfolding would be troubling enough if it revealed only hypocrisy, but the documented record demonstrates something far more sinister. It reveals a calculation. Steve Bannon was helping Robert Mueller send me to prison for 7 to 9 years. That was the recommended sentence prior to my full and unconditional pardon. So it is that's my beef with Steve Bannon, who would like to know what my problem is with him. But if you look at the sum total of these new emails, you see in the 2 weeks before Epstein's death, the infamous pedophile texted to Bannon saying, "Now you can understand why Trump wakes up in the middle of the night sweating when he hears that you and I are friends." In a 2018 text exchange, Epstein offered Bannon the use of his pedophile island and his Palm Beach home anytime he'd like, according to Epstein. Bannon responds saying, "Thanks, brother." In a 2018 email exchange with his brother Mark, trashing President Trump, Epstein commented, "All good, Bannon is with me." Now, I've explained why I have my own beef with Steve Bannon, but I do think we have to examine the larger question. The recent revelations concerning Bannon's furtive communications with Epstein have struck the public square like a thunderbolt hurled from Olympus. The magnitude of his moral collapse cannot be overstated. What had been exposed is not mere contradiction in my case. It is not some momentary lapse of judgment. It's the portrait of a man whose interior architecture has been eroded by ambition, self-fascination, and a peculiar spiritual rot, in my opinion, that afflicts those who pretend to be prophets while trafficking in deceit. Bannon is the modern counterfeit oracle, wrapped in theatrical populism, driven by ego, cursed with a craving for relevance that leads him into the darkest alcoves of corruption.
The Roger Stone Show on the Red Apple Podcast Network. The Roger Stone Show on the Red Apple Podcast Network.
Welcome back to the Roger Stone Show. As I predicted to you last Sunday, the Jeffrey Epstein scandal and the Democrats seizing it has blown up spectacularly in their face. I can tell you, because I researched this for my 2015 book, The Clintons' War on Women, which I highly commend to you, The Clintons' War on Women. Chapter 7, the longest chapter in the book, Orgy Island, outlines the big-name politicians and political figures who went to Epstein's Island. William Jefferson Clinton was on the island 13 times, was on Epstein's plane 26 times, according to the FFA records. My information comes from the sworn testimony of Epstein victims, including Virginia Roberts Giuffre, who valiantly resisted attempts to settle that lawsuit, pushed forward with her lawsuit against Epstein. We're told roughly 2 months ago that she committed suicide. Having interviewed Virginia Roberts Giuffre, this poor woman, this Epstein victim, I highly doubt that. But now this is blowing up in the faces of the Democrats spectacularly. Also embroiled in this, former Clinton Treasury Secretary Larry Summers, forced to resign as the chairman, as the president of Harvard. Senate Majority Leader George Mitchell, Democrat. Name for me anyone. The number is open, 800-848-9222. Name me one Republican who went to Epstein's Island. There isn't any. However, to talk about backfire, Congresswoman Stacey Plaskett of the Virgin Islands was revealed through the release of these Epstein text messages as actually taking orders from Epstein during a hearing in which former disgraced Trump attorney Michael Cohen was being questioned. Epstein was actually feeding questions to Congresswoman Plaskett, but that's not all he gave her. He gave her massive campaign contributions and a personal loan. Which party is in bed with Epstein? The Democrats. The cavalcade of stupidity here is almost beyond belief. Let's take Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett of Texas. If this woman's IQ was 1 point lower, you'd have to water her like a plant. She's a DEI disaster, but she accused my good friend, former Congressman and now Environmental Protection Agency Director Lee Zeldin, of receiving donations from Jeffrey Epstein. Well, Crockett was right. The only problem was that donation came after Jeffrey Epstein was dead and was made by a Dr. Jeffrey Epstein who lives on Long Island. And if anybody in her staff or she herself had taken 3 minutes to look it up on the internet, she would have known that. But it was more important to attack Donald Trump's cabinet member, the most able Lee Zeldin. So the Democrats have been screaming that Donald Trump needs to call for the release of the Epstein files. And after I met with him in Washington last Wednesday, he did. And now it will all be released. What you're going to see, what we've seen so far, there's an enormous amount of information here beyond the derriere kissing by Steve Bannon of the pedophile, with whom he clearly was in close touch, is the fact that Epstein was a Trumper, a hater of Donald Trump, and that those who are embroiled in the scandal are all Democrats. Sometimes you have to be careful what you wish for, as they say. It is absolutely clear now that they're attacking the Attorney General of the United States because she says she's reopening the investigation into Epstein to see who else was on the island. She was asked by I think it was Ken Delanian, the CIA operative who poses as a reporter for NBC. He was fired by the LA Times, by the way, for clearing his stories with the agency, asking her how come she said there was nothing else to investigate and now there is. I would remind her that under the Constitution of the United States, the chief law enforcement officer of the country, Donald Trump, can direct the Attorney General to investigate anyone he wants. They asked for it. The Clintons were funded in the Clinton Foundation and the Clinton Global Initiative by Jeffrey Epstein, who put up the millions of dollars as seed capital. The Tara Mar Foundation, headed by his pimp, Ghislaine Maxwell, was supposed to be an environmental nonprofit, was a grooming pool for young female interns, funded entirely by Bill and Hillary Clinton and their foundation. They are so busted. They will really wish they had never raised this issue. Here are the facts. Donald Trump banned Jeffrey Epstein from his life in late 2004, before Epstein was ever exposed in Florida as having raped a child. And that is the truth. You're listening to The Roger Stone Show. When we come back, JFK researcher Larry Snapp, one of the smartest guys I know, is going to tell us what we know and what we still don't know at the 62nd anniversary of the murder of JFK.
The Roger Stone Show on the Red Apple Podcast Network. The Roger Stone Show. Entertaining and informative on the Red Apple Podcast Network.
Welcome back to the Roger Stone Show. President Donald Trump has released a 28-point peace plan that will bring an end to the war between Russia and Ukraine. He is demanding that both sides get on board, as there will never be a better opportunity for peace than there is right now. For those who insist that we have an obligation to defend Ukraine, they seem to forget that when the Russians agreed to the reunification of East and West Germany, we signed an agreement with the Soviets called the Budapest Memorandum, in which we, the United States, signed by Secretary of State James A. Baker III on behalf of our country, agreed not to push Ukraine into NATO, which is to say, not to mount NATO missiles paid for by U.S. taxpayers aimed at Russia. We reaffirmed our agreement not to do this in the Minsk Accords. Therefore, the action by the Biden administration to push NATO, Ukraine membership for NATO, into NATO, is a violation of those agreements and the reason for this war. This idea that Putin wants to gobble up all of Ukraine and then Germany and then France and then Poland is nonsensical. The decision, as put forward by Trump, I should say, the deal would reaffirm the Ukraine's sovereignty, would achieve a non-aggression pact between Russia, Ukraine, and Europe, would stop Russia from incurring into Europe, would facilitate better relations with Russia and the NATO nations, would give security guarantees to Ukraine in the event that Russia violated the agreement, would limit Ukrainians' military buildup, keeps Ukraine out of NATO, consistent with 2 signed agreements we have with the Russians previously. But it also stations European fighter jets in Poland. It reinstates democratic elections in Ukraine, which I assure you Zelensky does not want, having postponed them indefinitely. So don't tell me this fight is about democracy. It would invest considerable resources into rebuilding Ukraine, as much as $10 billion, which is currently sanctioned funds in the United States that belong to Russia, would reintegrate Russia into the global economy, would extend nuclear non-proliferation treaties between the nations, would split nuclear power between Russia and Ukraine, and start the de-radicalization process. In my opinion, President Trump has created a fair and equitable deal that both Russia and Ukraine should be able to agree upon. Now, he's given them both a deadline of this Thursday. That's Thanksgiving. President Trump is done spending billions of dollars, much of which, by his own admission, is being stolen, and is exerting maximum pressure to finalize this deal. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is reportedly not happy about it, as ending the war would end his spigot of welfare from the United States and a lesser amount from our European allies. No more golden-plated toilets for him and his cronies. By the way, I went down and saw his multi-million-dollar condominium in Miami. How does a politician afford that? Zelensky said, now the pressure on Ukraine is one of the most difficult. Now Ukraine must find itself facing a very difficult choice, either loss of dignity or the risk of losing a key party. No, it's the loss of the millions of dollars that we have been raining on him with very little accountability. As President Trump famously told Zelensky, he does not hold the cards. The only thing Zelensky has going for him is no shame, and no concern for the welfare of his own people. He'll throw away as many of them as necessary, showing them into the meat grinder of war to fuel this power trip and his vices, even though he knows this war is lost. In my opinion, it's time for President Trump to cut Zelensky off, regardless of whether or not he accepts the peace deal on Thanksgiving. For those out there who want to call me a Russian stooge, let me remind you, my relatives were killed on the streets of Budapest in 1956 by Russian tanks. I have no affinity for Putin, the Russians, and my entire political background is rooted in my anti-communism. But we have spent too much on this war, and too many people have died. It is time to end the war. Meanwhile, after a bombshell report by Tucker Carlson exposing the social media behavior of Thomas Matthew Crooks, the man who the FBI tells us attempted to assassinate President Trump last year in Butler, Pennsylvania, more details are emerging about his social media activity, and I guess it's unsurprising. Crooks referred to himself with the pronouns of they, them, on different social media profiles, indicating he identifies as a non-binary or transgendered individual. He also posted frequently on DeviantArt, a community known to be for furries, which is a sexual provision based on role-playing by humans pretending to be animals. Whatever. As Tucker Carlson's report showed, Crooks has also left a continuous string of terrorist threats on various social media profiles throughout the course of the years. An unnamed source who's familiar with Crooks' social media profile said he left a digital trail of violent threats, extremist ideology, and admiration for mass violence. He spoke openly of political assassination, posted under his real name, and was even flagged by other users who mentioned this to law enforcement in their replies. Despite this, his account remained active for more than 5 years and was only removed the day after the attempted shooting of President Donald Trump. None of this online activity was referenced in the final congressional report released in December of 2024, which to me makes the whole thing even more troubling. So the question becomes, why was Thomas Matthew Crooks allowed to say these things on social media without being censored, and why did the feds and authorities want to cover this up? The FBI came out this week and said that their investigations came to the conclusion that Thomas Matthew Crooks acted alone. There was no conspiracy to think of. So as usual, once again, it's the lone nut who did it. So move along, nothing to see here. Back to your regularly scheduled programming. With all due respect to FBI Director Kash Patel and Dan Bongino, this feels like the same old runaround that we would expect from the FBI and other deep state entities in the pre-Trump area. We must demand the truth and find out now how President Trump was almost assassinated. There's clearly much more to the story than we are being told. I have enormous respect for Tucker Carlson for having the courage to put this information forward. Meanwhile, President Trump has ordered an end to the temporary protected status, TPS, of immigrants in the state of Minnesota, and the Somali community is predictably up in arms as a result of this. This comes in response to a City Journal report explaining how welfare fraud in Minneapolis is funding the famous al-Shabaab terror group back in Somalia. A source revealed to the City Journal in Minneapolis that the biggest funder of al-Shabaab is the Minnesota taxpayer, with millions being funneled from fraudulent schemes. Some of that had been discovered in recent months, including misrepresenting the number of autistic children to bilk hundreds of millions of dollars out of Medicare, this money being sent to the coffers of a terrorist group, al-Shabaab, in Somalia. Under Governor Tim Walz, there have been at least 28 different fraud scandals. In these liberal regimes, they're often too scared to investigate any ethnic minority group like Somalis because they fear being labeled as racist. Liberal like Walz want to prop up Somalis in Minnesota as banner citizens and the future of America when the reality paints a very different grim picture. Import the third world and you become the third world. So by ending this special status for Somalians living in Minnesota, this will impact a very small number of people, roughly 500 people. But it will be an important gesture to the Somalis that their corruption and their theft of U.S. taxpayer money will not be tolerated here. You will not have Sharia law here in America. Here we live under the U.S. Constitution and the laws passed by both houses of Congress and signed into law by our president. Under Sharia, we will have the rule of the jungle. You will abide by the rule of law and the Constitution if you live in the United States, or you will be locked up and deported if you are here illegally. Those are the options. There will be no more special treatment for foreigners. Meanwhile, two of the most honorable patriots serving this administration, Federal Housing and Finance Agency Director Bill Pulte and Trump pardon attorney Ed Martin, according to NBC, were under investigation by the DOJ. Turns out, however, that this report is just more fake news. This is a collaboratory ruse between the deep state and specifically NBC. We spoke about Ken Dilanian earlier. This is the single most irresponsible distortionist pretending to be a journalist practicing today. A report by Dilanian and his woman partner at NBC claimed that Bill Pulte, the director of the Federal Housing Finance Agency, and White House pardon attorney Ed Martin are under investigation based on speculatory claims they've abused their authority in pursuing justice against FBI Director James Comey, Senator Adam Schiff, and Letitia James. According to the reports, the Trump DOJ is investigating Pulte and Martin. This turns out to be categorically false. The Justice Department is not investigating its chief pardon attorney, Ed Martin, or its top housing regulator, Bill Pulte, for their role in probing Senator Adam Schiff, and recent grand jury subpoenas were designed to secure documents about Schiff's mortgages and ascertain their origins. Let's be very clear. Every document being used in the prosecution of New York Attorney General of Letitia James, or potentially in the prosecution of Senator Adam Schiff, or potentially in the prosecution of Congressman Eric Swalwell, can be found online by anyone who has a laptop and half a brain. So there is no leak. We are going to come back to this. Right now, we go to our guest, Larry Schnapp, who is to me, the most respected JFK assassination researcher in the country. We'll be back with Larry after the break.
The Roger Stone Show on the Red Apple Podcast Network. The Roger Stone Show, entertaining and informative on the Red Apple Podcast Network.
Welcome back to the Roger Stone Show. Yesterday was, of course, once again the 62nd anniversary of the brutal murder of President John F. Kennedy in the streets of Dallas. Joining us now is the JFK researcher in the country who I respect above all others. I speak, of course, of New York City lawyer Larry Schnapp, who is more knowledgeable on the subject than literally anyone I know, and a man who regards it completely and totally without political bias, taking his research where the facts go. Larry, thanks for joining us.
Hi, Roger. Thank you. Sorry for the delay. I had little phone problems.
Not at all. We're going to adjust for that. I want to get your reaction to two things. One is this story we saw earlier in the week that, according to Congresswoman Anna Paulina Luna, who I know you met with not long ago, and hopefully you'll be working more closely with, because she's a true American hero in her pursuit of the missing information we still don't have. There were reports of a CIA whistleblower revealing that there were those in the agency bragging about their efforts to mislead congressional investigators regarding Lee Harvey Oswald's activities in Mexico before President Kennedy was assassinated. What do you make of this, Larry?
Yes, this is Tom Piercy, and we knew about this story a couple years ago. We knew about this fact that he went into this CIA facility in Herndon, Virginia, and they had a special SCIF room for JFK records. And there was a file misfiled in the records he was looking for. He wasn't looking for JFK records. He had previously worked with the State Department. He was working on the Foreign Relations series for the Carter years. And there was this misfiled document, and it was a 50-page IG Inspector General report showing how there was basically a damage assessment saying how they performed with the HSCA. And they were bragging about how they basically fooled them, and no damage had been done. Now, this man was afraid of releasing his name all these years, but particularly during the Biden administration, because he feared he was going to be prosecuted, as you know. Once President Trump issued his executive order, he now became free enough to actually put his name to the story. And he's a very credible person. And I think CIA Director Rutledge needs to get to the bottom of this. And if there's a SCIF full of JFK records, President Trump's order has essentially declassified every record the government has about JFK assassination. Those records should be released immediately.
Yeah, I think you were the one who pointed out to me that as good as the president's order was, it wasn't really sufficiently broad, meaning it ordered the National Archives to make everything public. But as you pointed out to me, there are various bureaus and elements in our government who still have records regarding the assassination that they never turned over to the National Archives.
That is true, and in the lawsuit that I'm co-counsel to with Mary Farrell, we're going to be amending our complaint and take the litigation position that President Trump's order is broad enough. It's the way it's been implemented they've been focusing on the records in the JFK collection, which are the records that are in the possession of the National Archives. But President Trump said that he determined that it's in the public interest for all records to be released that pertain to the JFK assassination. So we're going to take the litigation position that it applies to all records. But the energy has been focused so far on releasing the records in the collection. But these are records that were never turned over to CIA. In fact, there's a memo that was uncovered which indicated they had provided a sanitized 3-volume set of records to Professor Blakely, when he was head of the HSCA, sanitized versions. And he looked at them and gave them back. The CIA person there said, "Is there any questions you have?" He said, "No." And they said he never found a person that was more uncurious than Robert Blakely. So this set of this SCIF room, we need to get to Director Ratcliffe and get him to let someone get in there and take a look at the records to see what's there.
We're going to take a quick break, and we'll be back with more of JFK researcher and respected attorney Larry Snapp on the other side.
The Roger Stone Show on the Red Apple Podcast Network. The Roger Stone Show on the Red Apple Podcast Network.
And we're back. We're talking to Larry Snapp, one of the most respected JFK researchers in the country, a very able New York-based lawyer who's brought a number of lawsuits to compel the U.S. government to release remaining JFK assassination records in the past, and I believe is doing the same today. Larry, I want to ask you about an incredible document which you sent me, a document which I have read about but never actually seen until now. This is a top secret report from the U.S. Justice Department reporting on sources in the Soviet Union who summarizing the views of the Soviet government in 1963 to the assassination of John F. Kennedy. And the most shocking revelation in this document is that the KGB, based on their own investigation and sources, believe that Lyndon Baines Johnson was the driving force, as I do, behind the assassination of John Kennedy. What do you make of this document?
Yeah, this was recently declassified. It's from 1966, and Hoover's forwarding this discovery to Marvin Watson at LBJ's office. And the reason I forwarded it to you is because Representative Luna had recently obtained from the Russians some sort of Russian dossier of about 100-something pages, and it hasn't been translated yet. But I don't think, from what the few people that have looked at it and who have Russian skills that this may not be the document that Hoover was referring to. But apparently, the Soviets did a 2-year investigation in '64 and '65 on the assassination. And I don't believe we've seen this, the actual report. We have this memo summarizing what the findings are. But I think this should be brought to the attention of Secretary of State Rubio. And maybe we can get this as part of the Ukraine negotiations. I don't know. I'm just, the Russians appear to be willing to turn over documents to us that they have about the Kennedy assassination. There's still 5 feet of records from the KGB in Minsk. So this might be a very opportune time to try to get these records. But this is kind of a bombshell.
It is a fascinating reading. And then lastly, you have been in the forefront of those who I think have been pointing out a number of documents that are not in the JFK records collection maintained by the National Archives, but which would be absolutely essential to getting a fuller picture of who killed John F. Kennedy. Give us a quick rundown of those, if you would.
Yeah, so when I met with Representative Luna, they asked me for a list of priority documents, and so I sent them to them. And we have talked about some of these in the past, but the leading ones, I think, are the FBI had a sting operation on Carlos Marcello in the mid-1980s, where he was allegedly caught on tape indicating that he was behind the assassination, that he knew Oswald, and that he actually was the one that put Ruby, in Dallas. Marcello was a very strong supporter of LBJ. I mean, he gave him lots of money, both in 1960 and before then. So we need to get these tapes, which were sealed during the Camtex sting operation released. There's also records that the CIA conducted right after the assassination. They apparently did an investigation in Miami of Cuban exiles and Castro supporters. They denied they did this, but from November 63 to March 64, they conducted this investigation. They did daily reports, and when the HSCA was around, this Donald Heath was the one who was in charge of this investigation, advised them of these reports that were sitting in the CIA, in an office in the CIA, and when there was no follow-up, and we didn't know who this man Donald Heath was for all these years because his name was redacted. He died in I think in 2018, and we learned his name then. So that those memos should be pulled up. Walter Sheridan did an investigation for Bobby Kennedy, and when the Assassination Review Board tried to get those files that he had deposited with the JFK Library, he had them sent to NBC, and as part of the Garrison investigation, and the ARB actually sued for those records, but then they went out of business and couldn't get them. So we've asked Congresswoman Luna to get copies of those. There are also papers of RFK that he had removed papers from the White House right after the president was shot, and we're trying to get those as well. And then we're trying to get the William Harvey travel records from 1963. This is another news item that occurred since the last time you and I spoke. The records that were released in March, there was a record there showing that Bill Harvey, after he had been relieved relieved from command of the ZR Rifle assassination group, got a certificate from the FAA, which allowed him to travel domestically in the United States without being put on any travel the list of travelers. And there is evidence that he was meeting in Florida with Johnny Roselli in April of '63, was making phone calls to Chicago and to Los Angeles, and had dinner with some Americans who were not undercover, and also paid for a first-class ticket back to Chicago. So what is he doing in the United States working on assassination materials? All these expenses were charged to the assassination effort, the ZR Rifle Group. So this is important information. We never before knew the FAA was involved with this. And leads me to believe that maybe Roselli and David Morales and others were traveling without being on the travel manifest either. So this is an important thing to get. And Representative Luna said she's going to try to get the copies of the transcripts of the interviews that William Manchester took of Bobby Kennedy and Jackie Kennedy for his book, Death of a President. The tapes were sealed at the request of the Kennedy family, not to be released till 2067. But apparently, Representative Luna is tenacious, and she's apparently gotten permission to at least get the transcripts. Right. So we're making progress, but you and I got to talk about getting some other of the agencies moving a little faster. We shouldn't have to rely on Representative Luna, one person, to get all these records released to comply with the order.
Agreed. All right, I'm afraid we have to leave it there. I want to thank our guest, Larry Snaps, for joining us on the day after the 62nd anniversary of the assassination of JFK. Once again, sadly, more questions than answers today. You're listening to The Roger Stone Show, and we'll be right back.
The Roger Stone Show on the Red Apple Podcast Network. Roger Stone Show. Entertaining and informative on the Red Apple Podcast Network.
Welcome back to the Roger Stone Show. Joining me now is Lori Gregory. Lori Gregory is a health freedom activist. She's actually the woman who brought me into the health freedom movement. She gave me an enormous amount of information regarding the safety and effectiveness of vaccinations, which I found shocking. I learned a great deal from my friendship with her. She's also a very good friend of Secretary of Health and Human Services, Robert Kennedy, and she's one of the most knowledgeable people I know in the so-called health freedom space. Lori, welcome to the Roger Stone Show.
Thank you so much, Roger. What an honor it is to be with you, and one of my great moments to be able to share with you what we've known for so long in this long litany of vaccine policy, and we still have a long way to go, unfortunately, but I'm hoping we're going to get there with this administration.
I know that there are some in the health freedom movement who are dissatisfied, I should say, with the progress to date of the Make America Healthy movement, essentially under the leadership of Robert Kennedy, but with the absolute blessings of President Donald Trump. I personally think when you're up against Big Pharma, one of the best funded and most powerful and insidious lobbies in Washington, D.C., that he's making amazing progress. What's your view?
I think we have inches that can add up to feet, and we have to take every win we can get. I also think that we have to look at what's doable, right? I mean, this week we had a lot of folks in MAHA getting excited because there was a shift on the CDC website about autism and vaccines. But Roger, if we're going to have accountability in this administration, we're going to have more than this sort of window dressing, which is actually adding to even more confusion because of the language that continues to deny the history of corruption that has led us to this point. So I think we have a short window here where we can accomplish some very important strides. Namely, it would be really incredible if the president could help us enforce the 1986 Act as it was intended. You know, this was passed by Congress and signed into law by Ronald Reagan in 1986. It was supposed to provide swift, generous, and non-adversarial compensation to those who are injured by vaccines. These are veterans in the war on disease. Unfortunately, the history of the act is that it's been just the opposite. It's been extremely adversarial. In some cases, we have injury cases that are lingering for 12 plus years, and it's been anything but generous. And of course, you know, the big elephant in the room is the gutting of removing residual seizure disorder, which is the bucket that all the autism cases used to go into in the 1990s. That was taken off of the vaccine injury table in 1996. And then despite a series of events after that indicating that, you know, we know there's been causation connections, including, Special Master Hastings said in a footnote in 2002, there were 6,000 cases being prepared for vaccine courts that were autism and residual seizure disorder related. He made a footnote that we've always compensated for autism cases as injury table cases, but autism and autism related diagnoses were removed from that table. And now we have, you know, thousands of children that have not been compensated. So there are some things that can be done to correct this. And it wouldn't take a tremendous effort for us to actually get a better performance out of this legislation.
I mean, as you know, up until Mike Pence became vice president, there was a dedicated website where you could go to see how many cases had been filed, how many people had been compensated. When Mike Pence, from Indiana, whose entire career was funded by Big Pharma, his career as governor, his career in the House, his ascendancy to the vice presidency, they no longer posted this information online. I'm not sure that the president, God love him, was aware of this. I think he became more broadly aware of the health freedom movement and the excesses and abuses within the health portions of our government in his out years as president, when he was not president. And of course, I still think that his historic alliance with Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Built a new potentially permanent governing coalition, But that is only if Republicans can continue to win the votes of those who put making America healthy again in the forefront of their agenda. You make an excellent point regarding the current status of the enforcement of the 1986 Act. This is something that absolutely needs to be done. Generally speaking, I would also like to get your views on the president's other health appointees. What is your view, for example, of our current head of the FDA?
Well, it's a great question. I think we've seen small moves, but I don't think MAHA's expectations are being met. Most of the FDA measures have been around food, and those are all good things. But, let's face it, Roger, the fact that vaccines cause autism is the least kept secret in Washington. Everybody knows, and everybody has known since the early 1990s, that there's a causal relationship between vaccines and autism, and the vaccine court itself has awarded hundreds of millions of dollars for autism. So we have a cover-up that, we can trace back to the 1999 Verstraeten study at the CDC, which shows causation. That led to Simpsonwood, where Verstraeten was instructed to bury it. So, I appreciate the team that Secretary Kennedy has assembled, and I have great hopes, as I know MAHA does. But it's kind of like calling out the emperor for not having clothes. We have to identify that if President Trump truly is going to make autism his most important issue in his administration, then we have to identify better ways to not only define and reestablish this injury on the vaccine table for compensation, but we also have to start releasing the data. We have data that will show clinically as well as in health outcomes. It would provide transparency that would give evidence of causation, which is essential in the vaccine court. So we have a mechanism that we're not utilizing. We have Medicare, Medicaid data. We have data, that is managed by Pfizer, which is the Vaccine Safety Data Link. There's 21 million patients in that database. We have so much access. If we had public access to that data, we could provide the information that is needed to get swifter compensation for the vaccine injured, and we could address this issue of autism once and for all. We have to have compensation for the injured, and the data is the key.
A key question here, and that is it conceivable to you that it is not the vaccination itself that causes autism, but the things that are included, such as mercury, that may be the causation?
Well, there are various ways that autism can present itself. Autism itself was never listed on the table. The description of autism can be autoimmune. There's autism that looks like neuroinflammatory condition. There's autism that's mitochondrial. Experts would need to define and put a notice in the Federal Register that would allow for 30 days to comment in order to properly define, how there is causation connecting the application of vaccines and vaccine injury in its expression for conditions that can at times be diagnosed as autism. And this sort of detailed analysis of not only defining the term, but then figuring out how to identify ways to, put that information into a feedback loop to make better products. A lot of MAHA call for the repeal of the act. They don't think vaccine makers should have any kind of liability protection for their products. But at the end of the day, Roger, it's much easier to fix policy that's broken than to try to reestablish brand new policy. And so enforcing the act and implementing it in its actual the way that it serves the vaccine injured and vaccine court would be a huge win for MAHA. And I would beg to say, actually, that pharma would be relieved because they don't want to give up that fabulous business model of liability protection. So I think that there could be a win-win if President Trump would consider, some of these changes need to be done through a statute, but he could tie that to one of his must-have bills, and that would be to expand the filing window. We have a policy of vaccine injury denial instead of a policy of vaccine injury compensation. We need to make that shift, and making a couple of these tweaks would actually allow for the act to do what it was supposed to do, and it would correct a lot of the brokenness that's been in the system that has created this problem to begin with.
All right, we have to leave it there. I want to thank my guest, Lori Gregory, and thank all of you for tuning in today to The Roger Stone Show.
Thanks for listening to The Roger Stone Show. You can hear The Roger Stone Show Sunday afternoons at 3. If you like the podcast, share it with your friends and listen anytime at WABCRadio.com and download the WABC Radio app. Hit that subscribe button on all major podcast platforms. Plus, follow WABC on social on Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, and X. See you next time for a new episode so you never have to wonder.
What the heck is going on here?